Welcome back to the Poetry of Night. In this episode, I'm going to circle back a little bit to Trockle, who we talked about last time, and then move more into a more contemporary poet, Brigit Pegeen Kelly, who unfortunately died in 2016. But I was lucky enough to be able to hear her read twice, most memorably the second time at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, when her book, The Orchard, was recently out. And she gave a wonderfully spirited, strong, bold, full-bodied reading, and she came into the auditorium wearing clothes that I could imagine her wearing in the fields of Arcata, where she was sometimes living at that time. She spent a lot of her life living in fairly rural environments, and you'll see or hear how her familiarity with all of that seeps into her poetry. Both Trockle and Kelly poems regularly attract words like visionary or prophetic from readers and critics, and both create such strange and striking scenes or situations that at times they might also feel almost dreamlike or surreal, or, especially in the case of Brigit Pegeen Kelly, almost magically real or even mythic, where Trockle's poems have a more expressionistic feeling about them. Though last time we saw how he too could sometimes run with folk figures as an inspiration. Poet critics like Stephen Yenser have noted Kelly's religious imagination. Both of these poets, sometimes in the course of a single poem, write poems that seem to tremble between the marvelous and the ominous, almost as though you can imagine a musical composition hovering between major and minor chords. At the same time, with both of these poets, we sense a deep connection to and a precise attention to nature. And many of their poems happen outdoors in natural settings, however strange or untoward or unsettling their events. And yet the poems move differently on the page. With Trockle, even in some of his darkest moments, the poems are essentially lyric, however well observed. With Brigit Pegeen Kelly, there's a feeling of maximalism and extended narrative, and the poems run longer on the page. We don't know with Kelly if any of the material came out literally from a dream, or she just has, this is the way her imagination was moving. One effective strategy for writing a poem that comes from a dream is to report as clearly and precisely the images, the objects, the information that you would also see naturally in a diurnal waking state. Whatever the imaginative source was for Kelly's poems, we can tell that there's a really deep habit of close attention to nature, to detail, to the natural world that gives the poems a sense of veracity, even in their strangeness. So that you can begin to hear the contrast I'm talking about, I want to read one last poem of Trockle's, which may have been the final poem of his life. We know for sure it was one of the last ones written, Grodek, which comes out of his traumatic experience of that moment in World War I that I discussed last time, where he was confronted with 90 damaged soldiers, badly wounded soldiers. This poem, I was gladdened to hear chosen as the first poem a group of international poets read at the beginning of the start of the war in Ukraine, when there was an international gathering of poets reading poems written both by people who were enduring the current conflict and others who had been writing about poems in that area. And you'll hear that in spite of the beauty of the environment that he's writing in, he pulls no punches in terms of depicting the grotesqueries and the horrors of what he's seeing and its implications. You will also hear, again, the way he uses color as a key descriptor in these poems, sometimes to surreal or expressionistic effect, and the way very often he leads with the sense of sound. Grodek. At evening, the woods of autumn are full of the sound of the weapons of death, golden fields and blue lakes over which the darkening sun rolls down. Night gathers in dying recruits, the animal cries of their burst mouths. Yet a red cloud in which a furious god, the spilled blood itself, has its home, silently gathers a moon-like coolness in the willow bottoms. All the roads spread out into the black mold. Under the gold branches of the night and stars, the sister's shadow falters through the diminishing grove to greet the ghosts of the heroes, bleeding heads. And from the reeds, the sound of dark flutes of autumn rises. O prouder grief, you bronze altars, the hot flame of the spirit is fed today by a more monstrous pain, the unborn grandchildren. Sometimes in classes, when I've talked about Trockle and the poet Paul Celan, I've used the phrase, the silence under nightmare. And even here in Grodek, with the terrible sounds of the weapons and the cries, these sounds arise from what would otherwise be the more sacred silence of the place where these things are occurring. And then we know that the soldiers are headed into the dreadful silence of death. So even here in this poem, we can understand how silence becomes a force of multivalent resonance with his work. Before I leave off talking about Trockle this time, I want to give a nod to a couple of websites where you can find a number of amazing short films made in his honor at the moment of the centennial of his death, from a festival where filmmakers were challenged to respond to a poem based on the figure Caspar Hauser. So I encourage you to explore the short films in Poetry Film Vienna and Moving Poems. As disturbing as the images in the poem Grodek are, if you look again at that poem, you'll see the way, line to line to line, Trockle is moving cleanly down the page. And I want you to keep that in mind as we look at the very different approach that Brigit Pegeen Kelly took in her poem Black Swan, which you can almost imagine as a kind of origin story or a response that someone might have to a young child asking where it came from or how it was born. Black Swan. I told the boy I found him under a bush. What was the harm? I told him he was sleeping and that a black swan slept beside him. The swan's feathers hot, the scent of the hot feathers and of the bush's hot white flowers as rank and sweet as the stewed milk of a goat. The bush was in a strange garden, a place so old it seemed to exist outside of time. In one spot, great stone steps leading nowhere. In another, statues of horsemen posting giant stone horses along a high wall. And here were triangular beds of flowers, flush with red flowers, and there circular beds flush with white. And in every bush and bed flew small birds and the cries of small birds. I told the boy I looked for him a long time, and when I found him, I watched him sleeping, his arm around the swan's moist neck, the swan's head tucked fast behind the boy's back, the feathered breast and the bare breast breathing as one, and then very swiftly and without making a sound, so that I would not wake the sleeping bird, I picked the boy up and slipped him into my belly, the way one might slip something stolen into a purse, and brought him here. And so it was. And so it was. A child with skin so white, it was not like the skin of a boy at all, but like the skin of a newborn rabbit, or like the skin of a lily, pulseless and thin. And a giant bird with burning feathers, and beyond them both, a pond of incredible blackness, overarched with ancient trees and patterned with shifting shades, the small wind in the branches making a sound like the knocking of 1,000 wooden bells. Things of such beauty. But still, I might have forgotten, had not the boy, who stands now to my waist, his hair a cap of shining feathers, come to me today, weeping because some older boys had taunted him and torn his new coat, had he not, when I bent my head to his head, said softly, but with great anger, I wish I had never been born. I wish I were back under the bush, which made the old garden rise up again, shadowed and more strange. Small birds running fast and the grapple of chill coming on. There was the pond, half circled with trees, and there the flowerless bush. But there was no swan. There was no black swan. And beneath the sound of the wind, I could hear, dark and low, the giant stone hooves of the horses, striking and striking the hardening ground. Like with Trockle, there's a lot of natural imagery and strangeness. It's unsettling. But unlike with the Trockle poems, there's one hallmark move that Kelly often made in her poems, in The Orchard and also in earlier poems I've seen of hers, which I think of as related to what we might call in music riffing, those heavy repetitions or slight restatements, sometimes back to back to back, of the same phrase or sometimes the same image or the same word. And it's almost as though the poet is seeing these very strange things and lingering, can't continue without noting really how strange they are. And it's almost as though even the restatements and repetitions, when they come up, are a way of saying to the reader, yes, really, it really is this strange. This is what I'm seeing. It's as though that awareness shapes the telling. Meanwhile, in poems that are often very, very long single stanzas with long lines, there's a feeling, as in many prose poems, that as readers, we enter the poem and we can't escape. We're there for the ride. So if we want to look closely at this poem again for a moment, even in the first two lines, I told the boy and I told him, we see. In the next few lines, a black swan slept beside him, and then the swan's feathers hot, and then immediately the scent of hot feathers and the hot white flowers. It's often as though these lines and phrases are so linked together that it's almost as though they're joined like a strand of connected paper clips. And as these repeated descriptors seem to interlock one piece of this place into another, we're given a small break from the phenomenological reportage to hear this bit of direct statement. The bush was in a strange garden, a place so old it seemed to exist outside time. It's somewhat reassuring, yes, to understand that the speaker, too, finds all of this so strange, even though it's a somewhat risky move to step out from behind the camera of the poem for a moment. And after the description of the unnerving stone horseman, we soon get more of this riffing with, and in every bush and bed flew small birds, and the cries of small birds. The repetition is insistent. There's no reason that the phrase small birds needs to appear twice in that line. For instance, she might have just said, and their cries. And yet it almost makes these small birds feel all the more real, insisted on. Similarly, his arm around the swan's moist neck, the swan's head tucked fast behind the boy's back, makes us feel even more drawn into the idea that the speaker is staring at the swan, perhaps preparing us for the moment she decides to pick the boy up and slip him into her belly, the way one might slip something stolen into a purse. And then, in case we are really wondering now again, that voicey insistence, and so it was, and so it was. Of course, too, with good reason, so that I would not wake up the sleeping bird. Even in its beyond realistic myth-making, there's this feeling of infallible logic that appeals to our own more natural understandings of how to operate within a social order. And then toward the end of the poem, when the boy demands to go back, decries his birth, there was no swan. There was no black swan. Again, one of those statements would suffice for the simple imparting, but the doubling up and the added precision of color makes it all the more real and all the more plaintive. And of course, it is impossible to go back, to return. This characteristic move of hers, this insistent repetition, feels sometimes to me almost like a kind of emotional stuttering, as though the poet would take another step, but can't, simply can't go on. We're called upon instead to dwell, and then to move on with an increased sense of connection and interconnectivity. And when we hear here, instead of what is now missing, what has taken its place, dark and low, the giant stone hooves of the horses striking and striking the hardening ground. The natural order of things now suddenly given over instead to the man-made statues that are huge but not alive. There's a brief feeling of Ouroboros, a callback almost but not quite to the beginning of the poem, but with this chilling change in the natural order, which is nothing short of ominous. The poems in the orchard feel unified in place, almost as though we can imagine the poet or the speaker wandering through an extended, strange garden or acreage that has ponds and statues and strange things to see. Sometimes I and students of mine too have thought of this as an extended eco-poem, or we can almost think of it as a poem that represents Eden after the fall. Sometimes it feels to me like a long extended elegy, for instance, mourning a relationship that has died. I'm not able to make a case for one interpretation, one way of reading the poems in this book. I do know that Brigit Pegeen Kelly spent quite a bit of time at a retreat center near Urbana-Champaign where she taught, called Allerton, which had many of the features that appear in this book. And I've also read that one of her friends visiting her at one of the places she lived that was in a rural area reported seeing a stream of bees that made her believe that possibly the next poem I'm going to share of Brigit Pegeen Kelly's might be based on something observable and real. The dragon. The bees came out of the junipers, 2 small swarms the size of melons, and golden, too, like melons. They hung next to each other at the height of a deer's breast above the wet black compost. And because the light was very bright, it was hard to see them, and harder still to see what hung between them. A snake hung between them. The bees held up a snake, lifting each side of his narrow neck just below the pointed head, and in this way, very slowly, they carried the snake through the garden, the snake's long body hanging down, its tail dragging the ground, as if the creature were a criminal being escorted to execution, or a child king to the throne. I kept thinking the snake might be a hose, held by 2 ghostly hands, but the snake was a snake, his body green as the grass, his tail divided, his skin oiled, the way the male member is oiled by the female's juices, the greenness overbright, the bees gold, the winged serpent moving silently through the air. There was something deadly in it, or already dead, something beyond the report of beauty. I laid my face against my arm, and there it stayed for the length of time it takes 2 swarms of bees to carry a snake through a wide garden, past a sleeping swan, past the dead roses nailed to the wall, past the small pond. And when I looked up, the bees and the snake were gone, but the garden smelled of broken fruit, and across the grass a shadow lay for which there was no source, a narrow plinth dividing the garden, and the air was like the air after a fire or before a storm, ungodly still, but full of shapes turning. Once again, in addition to the arresting strangeness of this poem, this situation and these images, look at how this poet convinces us again and again through these slight repetitions and restatements in which perception, questioned, is being revisited and refined. The snake was a snake. And there's that long moment of mystery and suspense created by the several line delay between the wonderfully misdirecting title, The Dragon, and the moments when we first see the bees and begin to understand that the bees are carrying something when we see what it is. Again, then the repetition, a snake hung between them, the bees held up a snake, and then all the further description of exactly how they did this. I love to think of this poem as an extended metaphor, perhaps a metaphor for a guy being carried by swarms of women, finally invisible after the fact, except as, quote, a shadow for which there was no source, unquote, in the residue of, quote, a garden smelling of broken fruit, unquote. But that's my own reading, and it may be that these poems will speak most powerfully to us if we can resist our urge to try to find meaning or interpretation and just allow these impossible visions to exist. These poems are like little windows into the grotesquely miraculous. As a review of her earlier book, Song, in West Branch, begins, through the lens of a Brigit Pegeen Kelly poem, everything familiar looks strange, yet finally homed.